Like, it's actually okay for us to think of military men as Christian men, and dare I say, doing the work of God.
Today I have friend of the show and friend in real life, Professor Dr. Miles Smith. Miles, thanks, man, for being on.
Hey, George, good to see you, buddy.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking your new book, and it was kind of neat. This past weekend, I was in South Florida for this conference called the Kingdom Come Conference at Coral Ridge. You may know of Coral Ridge from D. James Kennedy. But anyway, it's this conference called Kingdom Come, and this is what I saw. I'm trying to queue up something here. Can you see it?
Yeah,
It
nice.
yes. This poor woman doesn't know that she's going to be on this podcast. But in the wild, your book, there it is, Religion and Republic. And what's the subtitle on that first book?
Christian America from the founding to the Civil War, I think
Yeah.
is the name of it. So, well, I appreciate the good folks at Coral Ridge for hawking my book, and so um, uh, Pastor Rob, thank you if you hear this, much appreciated. So,
That's pretty funny. Yeah. So that wasn't your first book though, was it?
it was, yeah, that was my
Oh,
first
okay.
book.
And just even as the subtitle of that book says, that you've sort of become known as a specialist in that time period between those two major wars early in our history, the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And this new book that we're going to talk about focuses on that time period also, right?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
basically material. I think it was the right choice at the time. I went back and forth on it, to leave out one of the big institutions where a religion interacts with, and that's of course the military. Um, and so I left that out because it just seemed to be too much to do for one book, and I wanted to keep that one kind of manageable. And so I started talking to Reese Laverty, who's an editor at the Davenant Press, and Reese said we should do another one. And so I think this one's a little different. And if you had to ask me, I think this one's probably more fun than Religion and Republic, um, because the thesis is probably a little bit more. I won't say controversial, but it's certainly something I think people think less about. We don't love to think about the degree to which war intersects with religion, because we hear a lot about religion and Christianity being a religion of peace and Jesus being a sort of peace oriented figure. But obviously, people have interacted with war and religion for a long time, and religious people have interacted with war, and military figures have interacted with religion. And so I kind of wanted to sort of look at how Americans have done their own part to sort of ask questions about God, about religion, especially the Protestant religion, um, in times of war and in militaries. So that's what that's all about. Valiant and Pious, the idea of the Christian soldier in America, 1776 to 1861. So I try to leave the Civil War for Civil War historians. I don't want to sort of get too much into their territory. So that's what this book is about. And I make a kind of a novel claim in there. And my argument is essentially that, and I think this is where it may be a little controversial, that American military officers, particularly in the Army and Navy, only in the Army and Navy, in the early Republic, were probably better trained political theologians than your average quote unquote evangelical minister.
And yes, I saw that. That's right there in the intro. Maybe preface, and we're gonna get to that. So yeah, man, we just jumped right in, which is good. And providentially, now I thought this book was coming out uh, this week, but it turns out it's coming out later in the summer,
Yeah,
which is
towards the end of the summer.
Yeah, which is fine. But why I say providentially is because preparing for this interview, you sent me a few chapters, the preface and a few chapters. And so I've been reading it. And then the Pope goes and the Pope goes and tweets this thing. I'm going to try to pull it up here, which immediately like brought you to mind. And so
Yeah.
the Pope says this thing, and then I say, Miles Smith would like a word. And I think I'm so like on the ball with that. But later in the day, I see you had addressed it like 10 hours before. So here's it's a thread, and the bottom of the three, and there's actually more in the thread, but the bottom of the three is the one everybody was commenting on. But he talks about turning our gaze to Jesus, who reveals himself as the King of Peace, and he offers himself and embraces humanity as the King of Peace. He did not arm himself or defend himself or fight any war. And he goes on and speaks about this, talks about the cross, and you think, this is Holy Week. That's what he's getting at. But then that last one there, this is our God, Jesus, King of Peace. And of course we say amen to that. But this is what he says, who rejects war, whom no one can use to justify war. He does not listen to the prayers of those who wage war, but rejects them, saying, even though you make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Isaiah 1:15. And of course, that is not the exegesis of Isaiah 1:15, with all due respect to his holiness. But like I said, well, Miles Smith would like a word, because your whole premise here is this deliberate fusion or integration of Christianity, and a very intellectual Christianity, honestly, into war making. And that's what we're going to talk about. But I want to look at your responses to this, because are you okay over there, like at Hillsdale, with because I know there's a lot of Catholics.
Yeah, I have a good relationship with
Yeah,
my Catholic colleagues.
yeah.
Uh,
So you're me too, by the way. I mean, my whole family's Catholic, honestly. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he listens to the prayers of those who wage war is your first one, and we'll talk about that. And then the next one I thought was good too. And then you say in a separate tweet, I address this assertion about Christianity in war in my new book, forthcoming from the Davenant Institute. The preface ends with Article 37 of the 39 articles. Quote, it is lawful for Christian men at the commandment of the magistrate to wear weapons and serve in the wars. So very timely to have this conversation.
um, yeah, well, I think that the Pope seems like a nice enough guy, and so I think that obviously there's a Christological really problem there with his exegesis. That's obviously that I think what his point is that there's a sort of Christ almost in his earthly pastoral ministry was a man of peace, but we also know that Christ as a part of the Godhead does listen to the prayers of men at war. And I think this is maybe the essential problem with Catholic, and I think I would say evangelical political theology now these days too. And I'm using evangelical in a way that doesn't include Presbyterians. So for PCAers who want to be evangelicals, tough luck. You're not today. You're getting lumped in with Lutherans and Anglicans, which is, by the way, where the Presbyterians should stand with the other two magisterial Protestant traditions. Obviously, the entire sort of the Reformation is predicated upon rejecting an idea wherein that the church has to govern or can govern something like war or diplomacy or foreign policy. So the Pope doesn't get to decide these things. The magistrates do. And that's the essential, that's the first cause of the Reformation. I know that makes us uncomfortable because we want to think the justification is the first cause of the Reformation, but no, actually a specific political theological proposition is. And that political theological proposition is that kings determine the terms of war and the terms of peace and who can and cannot take up arms, and that that is rightly ordered, not the church. So the Pope's proclamations are the church sort of weaving in to a place that's really not its prerogative. And so what's funny is I think that this is where the Pope is kind of being a theocrat a little bit. And to his credit, he's being intellectually consistent by doing this. I don't think the Pope is a dishonest man. I actually like Leo the 14th tremendously. He seems to be a likable enough guy who I think is just doing what he's been taught, sort of practicing what he's been taught Roman political theology is. Of course, I'm a Protestant and I reject that political theology. And my book is very much predicated on this particular rejection. George, you've read the preface, and I think that's what this is all about. Like, it's actually okay for us to think of military men as Christian men, and dare I say, doing the work of God. I had a short piece up at Fontes a while back. I can link to that in the show notes, George, and I sent it to the president of my college, and I was just saying, hey, I think that we need to start talking about things like this. And he was very complimentary and sort of said, yeah, I'm a fellow of the Military History Center here at Hillsdale. So I think of war as something that is, dare I say, even deeply Christian at times. And that makes a lot of people really squeamish.
It sure does.
And especially a certain type of evangelical, I think it's telling very few evangelical Protestants participate in the type of debates that we have here on campus about war and religion. My colleagues in the Military History Center are a few Lutherans, a couple Roman Catholics, and myself. And so I think,
yeah, to go back to something that's probably not really related to the book, or it is a little bit, but you said, talk about the Reformation, and you made that comment about, we think it's about justification, and it is, but it was first about sort of the Pope's interaction with the state. Would you, again, totally probably off topic from your book,
yeah,
but would you say that's some of your own Anglican influence that of the Reformation, particularly in England, which cared very much about that?
yeah, no,
Um,
I would say I would say it's all the Reformation. Every single one of the major Reformed traditions, I think, shares this. Um, because Calvin's a good example. In the Institutes, Calvin actually says that the most sacred calling a person can have is to be a magistrate. And of course, he would have understood that military functions are a part of the magistrate. So soldiers and mayors, for example, are both magisterial jobs. And so it's I don't think it is merely Anglican. I think that
well,
this is
my
something.
point,
Yeah,
yeah, my point is more along the lines like when you think again of Luther's big justification
mm,
moment, and
yeah,
here I stand. Like obviously Calvin, Luther, all those guys uh, believed and were standing for a more limited role of the Pope. Uh, there was limits to what he could
yeah.
say, but it just seems to me, I always thought like the whole English Reformation was a little different. It seemed like more related to the Pope's authority to the church, or to the nation of England, as opposed to some of these justification arguments initially.
Yeah, so I think that's actually maybe a trope. I don't know how true that is, and
Okay.
I'm not picking on what people are, because, for example, who is Martin Luther standing in front of when he says, "Here I stand, I can do no other"?
Forget him.
He's standing in front of a political group, not a really. It's what's interesting is I think actually this is maybe something that we're thinking about. Our ideas of justification are perhaps downstream from our political theology. And I'm sure I sent shivers
Well, there's
down
a
the,
book. There's a book in that we can
yeah, yeah,
let's
um,
get back into your
yeah,
book though. So I'll read a couple of things that kind of set out what you were doing in the book, and then we can launch from there. Right there in the beginning of the preface, you say, I've set out to research how early American soldiers and clerics conceived of the connection between military service, war making, and their Christian practice, and how American clerics articulated Christianity's interactions with war. You go on to say this book, maybe this is in the intro, this book proposes that the early national United States, the period between the election of George Washington in 1789 and the presidency of Andrew Jackson, continued an historic Protestant and Western tradition of war and statecraft. This book's novel thesis, if it can make a claim to novelty, is that the conservative Protestant nature of the military was not merely social or religious, but political and statutory, in a subservient symbiosis with Protestant natural right political order. Okay, so what is your thesis?
My
Given those
thesis,
statements, yeah.
I don't think that, so a lot of, when I was read a lot of books um, about war, it would always have to deal with the Bible. So it would be sort of people it would be people researching how the Bible was used. And so my proposition is that I don't think that American statesmen, American military men looked to the Bible, and I also think that this did not make them not Christians. I think that they're deeply Christian, a lot of them deeply committed churchmen, and it's precisely because they're Protestants is why they don't think they need to look to the Bible or to a pastor to give them permission to carry out to go to war, to act in
But they
military
did,
capacity.
but part of what you're pointing out is those that the clergy actually did support the state and preached on these things and
Yeah,
encouraged participation.
yeah. And so what I would say is I think what we tend to sort of assume, this is a good segue, George. We tend to assume that the church or that soldiers or statesmen went and looked to the Bible and maybe kind of like asked the pastor, like, "Hey, can we do this?" When actually it's the states kind of saying certain things, and the church is actually following the lead of the state. And I think that's maybe what is really novel for a lot of evangelicals to consider is that that um, almost sounds like syncretism or Erastianism, but what I think it is it's just how Protestantism works on political things. The church is called to um, support the state in specific ways to kind of help uphold the temporal order. Um, and this is not the church being the state. For example, at my church, we have what's called the prayer for the whole state, and in that we pray for our military, the people who serve in the military. Any healthy Anglican church, you will do that. And so, what is this? It's the church praying for the not just the military, but the state to be rightly ordered. We pray for the president. We pray for the governor. And this is us being called into the service of our countries in particular ways. I think obviously the state has the right to call the church into service for things that the church is charged to do. Um,
Right. Okay.
and
So,
so now the state can't call the church into service for things that the church doesn't have the ability to do. So like the state can demand can set a Thanksgiving Day, for example. You have the in the 19th century and well into the 20th, you had governors would say, "Hey, I'm appointing a day for Thanksgiving. Y'all go to church and give thanks." Um, we're appointing a day of prayer and supplication. Y'all go to church and pray and supplicate. So a lot of people say we kind of do this thing where we say, "Well, that's telling the people to do things." Well, the people who are filling the churches are doing these things in a churchly capacity. So it's not to say that the church has been annihilated and has become the state, because the church has a voice in this too. But this is not something that's egregious or Erastian for the state to demand. Um,
right, that's a great segue, and I'm jumping all over, but this is one thing I want to try to understand because you do as part of this is this whole idea of chaplaincy, which I definitely want to get into given my current
Right.
role, and but you say this later in the introduction, which is chapter 1. I understand, if I understand right. They did not associate these activities, M dash Protestant chaplaincy, chief among their expression, again, with salvation, the gospel, gospel witness, or even churchly activity. It says precisely because church and state were separate, religious ministers could aid martial and political agents and causes in the perpetuation of political aims because politics was humans ordering society. And it's toward the natural goods. But what I'm trying to understand is why did they even want chaplains in the military
Yeah.
if this isn't quote unquote churchly activity? What function are they providing there if not soul care and a view of Christian ethics, etc.? If that's not like, what's their utility, the chaplains that are being placed in wartime?
So the chaplains are there to do they're there to do religious functions, but they're acting at the behest of the state and not at the behest of the church. And so let me ask you this: you're a chaplain. I think technically you would fall into you're a chaplain to the state government of Florida.
Yeah,
Um,
and actually, I have the same endorsement that I'm endorsed by the same agency that endorses the military chaplains. So yeah,
right.
I've gotten. Yeah.
Um, and so, who gives you permission to be a chaplain to the state of Florida? The Presbyterian Church in America or the state of
Yeah.
Florida?
No, it's the PCA. Yeah.
So it's the church. So who
Right.
gives
Well,
you
I
the
mean, the way I say it is, it's not like they're asking for me to be there.
right? So, but they allow you to be there. And so, what's interesting is imagine a world in which the state of Florida regularly calls the Presbyterian Church and says, "Give me George. Give me Bert Hasler. Give me Porter Harlow." I'm just thinking of like
Yeah.
valuable
Yeah.
guys in the PGA who do this. Um, that's what the military's doing in the early republic. They're saying, "I want George Sayre. I want Bert Hasler. Give them to me. In fact, I'm telling you to give them to me."
But for
This is
distinctly spiritual reasons, right?
for spiritual reasons, but not churchly reasons. And I think this is what's hard. Is they aren't creating churches, right? No one goes to a ship. Now they may say this group of sailors is my church, but the ship itself doesn't become a church, right? There's all sort of two kingdoms problems we would have at that proposition. And so I think what we're confronted with is that the state actually gets to the early Republic American state actually is comfortable, sort of even, can I say the word demand here and people won't get mad at me? Demanding things from the church that sort of feels a little squeamish to us in the early 21st century. So
So you do right in line with that. Protestant religion in the early republic military was not voluntary. It was mandatory and institutionalized. So not only
yeah,
were they asking the church to send us your guys, but they were then requiring the military to have this distinctly Protestant identity.
yeah, there's states. I mean, I mean, for better or worse, right? I'm not even sure I love it. Uh, I mean, this is
You
this is
love
what's
it.
interesting.
You love it.
Yeah.
You could say
Well,
it.
yeah. Well, I mean, if we start giving prayer books out, yeah, I'll love it. But no, I mean, I don't. I can honestly tell you, like, I'm on the fence about this. Like, I don't know if it's the best thing or not. Um, but no one thinks it's crazy. I think this is just my attempt for people to be honest about this stuff, is that no one in the early republic, you don't have the old school Presbyterian church saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe that we have desecrated ourselves by participating in military trip." No one's doing that. Um, and so it seems like they kind of think, well, no, that's something the state can ask of us. And so there you go. It's just kind of part and parcel of what happens. And so I think people can say this isn't what should be. I think my question, though, if people want to say, what's the essential question of the book? My essential question is, like, what principle do you use to sort of say this is not how it should be, um, because it seems like the Protestant principle is such that the state gets to ask for these things.
Would you say that's a major that is the major theme of the book?
I think it's a major thing for sure.
Because one
And
now again, I haven't read the whole thing, obviously, but one thing that's coming out was that was part of it. There's this integration there, recognition, it's valued, but then how the church actually viewed war itself is a part of the book.
Mhm.
So how does that play
Yeah,
out?
well, I think that
And that
it
relates to the
really
Pope's tweet too.
yeah, it really depended. I think that what's interesting is that, I mean, in the American Revolution, the most churchly people were typically against the revolution. The firmer your view on ecclesiology, almost the more likely you were to think that this revolution is wrong. Um, Guys like Reform guys like Zubley in Georgia, obviously High Church Anglicans, all up and down the colonies. The churchier you were, the more likely you were to sort of have questions over it. Greg Frazier, Master Seminary, has a great book with University Press of Kansas on this. Um, and so I think that this is one of the telling things is the people who had a pretty low view of the church's ability to speak to politics were more likely to be patriots. Um, and so this is the paradox. I think that evangelicals, we want the church to sort of have a big, sort of capacious place to speak about politics. Um, but we don't want Christian nationalism and we don't want theocracy. So how does that happen? I think that's maybe one of the essential sort of incongruities about modern evangelical thought.
Yeah, well, I think this is like again providential, the timing of your own career, your own focus in history, and the current debates going on, particularly in our country. I don't know what's going on in Europe and such related to like these nationalist, Christian nationalist debates. But like you're writing right at a time when this stuff is coming up.
Mm.
And like I've told you, like you're an enigma to me. I think you like that. You don't want to be put in a box, whereas, some guys are all in on Christian nationalism and other guys don't want any sort of public theology to even exist. And you're kind of like, yeah, it can or it can't, it's like people have the right to govern as they want, but your work really, how it contributed to the conversation. And I think the importance of your first book was it kind of recovers the mindset that the U.S. did conceive of itself as a Christian nation, and you do it in an intellectually honest way as opposed to some of the other maybe Christian ministries that are in ways that maybe not as true as we would hope them to be.
Well, I
Do you know
think
what I
that
mean?
maybe, yeah, no, I think the question for me is maybe it's one I'm asking myself. I mean, I don't think that any society gets church and state exactly right. So I think everybody's sort of having to slant towards, one thing or another. And so the way I think about the debate is I don't think of, say, ecclesiocentrism or maybe some more excessive things like people might say theonomy. I don't think of those things as in the same box as Christian nationalism. In fact, I think of, say, ecclesiocentrism. I was just with a guy I really respect, James R. Rogers, who has a volume with Pete Lightheart. James Rogers is a confessional Lutheran, LCMS. Lighthart's a more reform guy. And so to me, it's really a question of who are we going to look to as the more fundamental kind of unit of ordering society? Is the church going to order society or is the state going to order society? I think I've spent most of my life as a harder two kingdoms person. So that's my DNA. That I wouldn't say I'm full R2K, but I've kind of I sort of see myself going there. Um, I'm maybe rethinking that a little bit because I think ultimately, like if I don't know how, and R2K people I'm sure will disagree with me, but I think ultimately, if you arrive at the R2K position, you're closer to Christian nationalism than say I think anybody, either side would necessarily want to admit. Whereas I think that, say, ecclesiocentrism basically says, yeah, the state doesn't get to order this society at all. It's really the church is this foundational unit that kind of should sort of expand out and order society. Um, and so I think maybe I'm changing a little bit. I'm doing research on a book on Southern Presbyterians, and for West, I'm going to write it with Western Seminary's Press. I'm excited about that project, but I think one of the things I'm thinking about is um, maybe, do I think that the church or the prince is going to run the show? And so to your point, George, you're like, I can't put you in a box. I think, well, I think it's maybe because, like, I'm willing to say that I think you have to choose whether the church or a prince is going to kind of end up running the show. I don't think raw nature necessarily can do it, because my own society was pretty raw natural in the 18th century, and it was not a nice place. I mean, you're from George. You lived in my home geography for a little bit, and Rowan and Davidson County, and turns out those places in the colonial era were pretty brutal, right? Indian warfare, not these kind of nice churchy places, and it really took the Presbyterian Church coming in to provide some order. And so I think maybe I'm starting to be a slightly more ecclesiocentric person. So my friend James R. Wood will be happy to hear I'm saying nice
You
things
heard it
about
here
it.
first. We all
Yeah.
suspected it. We all suspected it, Miles.
Well, I
You're
think
just coming.
Anglicanism is ecclesiocentric by
Yeah.
its nature. I think Presbyterianism kind of can float between the two. So I think this is actually the debate that people are having, not necessarily. People aren't having debates over whether they're Christian nationalism or not, or they're ecclesiocentric or not. They're having a debate on where they are on that line.
Yeah.
Um,
So, it's important to understand what's meant sort of by the R2K, Reformed Two Kingdoms, because, we use that, and typically we're talking about, I prefer to call it modern Two Kingdoms, because it's a different thing than what Calvin was doing. And so, like, the traditional two kingdom view, or even if you take Kuyper's kind of spin on it with spheres, is simply the civil sphere or kingdom is separate from the church, only in that, like, the church doesn't get to dictate to it. But there's not a agnosticism from the civil sphere, or an ignorance from the civil sphere of Christianity, churchly things, and they're not afraid to apply their faith in the civil sphere. It's just not coming from the church imposed upon it. Whereas today's two kingdoms, again, coming out of Escondido, West Cal, and those guys, the two spheres are so separate that the civil sphere is not to apply distinctly Christian categories or ordering to society. You understand what I'm saying?
yeah.
Like, when obviously Calvin talks of two kingdoms, he has no problem with the civil realm ordering things toward Christianity, when you see what happened in Geneva. But, like, a Van Drunen today would not allow that. And so we just got to, like, when you're saying you're coming around to two kingdoms, you're not coming around to the modern view. It doesn't seem, based on our conversations, because you have no problem with the state presupposing Christianity and operating it as such.
Well, I can put it this way. So I know R2K guys. Very few of
Well, so do
them I
I.
know.
But
Yeah, very few of them I note are from. I just spent a lot of time in the very rural South. I took a trip with some students around here, and we went to southern battlefields. Um, and I stopped, and I'm not going to say what town it is, just in case anybody who's listening is a pastor in the area or something. But I stopped in a little southern town, and you know, George, the part of North Carolina where you and I lived in is actually not particularly rural. It's pretty industrial. There's a good sized town, every 10 minutes or so. My hometown is 40,000 people. Next to where you lived, about 15 miles away, which was 25, 30,000 people. And then, 10 miles up the road is Winston-Salem, which is 250,000 people. So it's not very rural. I was in a pretty rural part of Mississippi and Tennessee. Um, And what I realize is there's just very little in the way of churchly influence at all. Um, where I live now is a very pretty rural county as far as Michigan goes. Very little in the way of churchly influence. These are the places that you actually have a lot of, I guess, if you want to call like semi-paganism, like rural America, Trumpy America even, is pretty violent. Not a lot of healthy families. And so what I've sort of maybe come to sort of confront is that a place like Boston probably has more of a churchly influence in its politics still than even parts of the Deep South. And everybody thinks Boston's really civilized. Why? Because it was kind of a theocracy for a long time. The habits of the people, yeah, they're not turned towards Christianity now, but there's still sort of that very ordered kind of sense of the way things should be. And so I think that if you want a nice society, you probably want a Christian society. And so for any hard R2K person, I'm like, I will absolutely believe you guys, are committed to what you think when you move to an aggressively unchurched county in the Deep South, because that's what a natural law society looks
Well, what do you
like.
what do you what are you noticing in, because I mean, I don't know Mississippi. I've been
Yeah,
there, once a year for the last 3 or 4 years to a specific part of it, but it seems like overly, I mean, to me, it seems very churchly. Even you go in
yeah,
restaurants and you see cheesy, I hate to say it, pictures of Christ all over restaurants, and you're like, please, I just want
yeah.
to eat my meal. Like,
But I think
so what are you
it's
seeing?
yeah, I think it's the difference between a culture and actually a churchly culture. If I can I make that distinction? Um,
Yeah.
because like places with high rates of churchmanship also have historically high rates, figure high on the civilizational index. So think about the Netherlands, Switzerland, New England. These were places with aggressive rates of churchmanship. Now, I'm drawing a line between Christian culture and churchmanship here, because you and I both know that guess what? Not everybody who does Christian cultural stuff goes to church. Um, and so the South typically has had lower rates of churchmanship than even parts of the North. And so I think guess what? Like, I mean, if I were to say to people who wanted safety, and I'm thinking now about safety and like where can kids go play in a park or something like that. People are always choosing like these tiny little towns in New England, right? They're all safe, they're cute, they're well ordered. Why? Because they were all built around a sort of churchly order in New England. And if you read about the South in the colonial era and the early Republic era, I mean, how many people would, oh yeah, go send your kid to play in like, the heat of the night town, right? Or like Mississippi burning town, where even if you were to have, some sense of religious folk Christianity, you have the racial sort of divides. So I actually think that, I mean, a natural law society doesn't necessarily become an egalitarian one, even on race. Um, and so I think that there's just a lot of presumptions about nature that, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah.
I invite anybody who's into raw natural law to go live out in, Itabena, Mississippi. And I
Let's get
find
back to
they all live in nice areas, so nice areas with historically high rates of churchmanship, I might note.
let's get back to the book a little bit, because again, the thesis is awesome. Uh, you say this early on, maybe in the first page, part of the preface. Said more sensationally, during at least the first 80 years of the American Republic's constitutional life, the average U.S. Army and Navy officer, often conservative Congregationalists or Episcopalians, and occasionally Presbyterians, was a more educated and reliable political theologian than the average evangelical minister. Military officers trained at West Point and later at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis were more likely than evangelicals to have any historic classical or historically Protestant intellectual catechesis. One more sentence. Evangelicals in the early republic tended to be Baptists, Methodists, or other types of Wesleyans and Southern Presbyterians. You had to get it
Yeah.
in there. And they tended to politically identify with the nascent democratic and liberal ideologies of their day. All right, speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think especially before about 1830. So I've kind of got this break here at 1830. I think somewhere else in the books I basically say, but the Presbyterians change in 1830 or so, and I think they change in a big way, especially in the South. And you can read all about that in my next book. But I think basically what you have here is a sort of Jeffersonian sort of almost the Bible plus nature. And I talk about this a little bit, especially in the age of Jackson. There, one thing I don't want to do is say that evangelicals don't believe in natural law, because I think they do. I think that your Methodists and Baptists in the era do have some conception of it, but oftentimes they don't have sort of the instrumentation of transmitting natural law understandings through Protestant sort of Protestant intellectual development. And so it's just basically all nature and all the Bible. And so this is kind of Andrew Jackson, I think. I mean, the guy loves the Bible. He becomes a serious Christian. That's different than the development that an officer sees once he goes to West Point. They're reading Vattel and Grotius. They're reading the Reformers. They're reading guys who are transmitting this pretty throaty, even Protestant political theology into basically how to be a good officer. And they think that there's a sort of order that comes with that. And that question of order is one that really divides at least the military from evangelicals in the era, who are less committed to some of the older Protestant ideologies about order.
Okay. So at some point I read you wrote that there was a shift somewhere around the time of World War One and maybe before that. They're fighting. It wasn't ideological, I think is what you said. And then with World War One, it changes, and you attribute that to the evangelical influence. So what's going on there? Explain.
Yeah, I think it's Woodrow Wilson. One of the things so I think this is one of the things. There's this. I use this with my students a lot. There's that scene, I think it's on episode 2, Star Wars episode 2, where Palpatine looks at Anakin and says, "No, that's not something the Jedi would have told you." And so, like, these are all the sort of hidden truths that kind of people don't say because it's a little inconvenient. There's a proposition out there that Woodrow Wilson was a theological liberal. He was not a theological liberal. He's a political liberal. And so I think that what's interesting is, to me, I think that people want to believe, well, if you just have the right views on soteriology, you'll never do a certain type of liberal thing, be it theological, but more likely political. And I actually think that mere soteriological kind of rightness doesn't actually determine a lot. I think there's plenty of people who get soteriology right that are both theological liberals and political liberals. So I think that Woodrow Wilson brings a specific type of polemic into foreign policy and eventually the military. I mean, he runs afoul of all of my guys who are kind of these old elite Congregationalists, Episcopalians, and even Presbyterians. Wilson does not get along with them. Especially so, Wilson doesn't get along with the Northern Presbyterians. I mean, one of the things, I don't want to give too much away, that there's the grandson of someone really famous is a general in the army, a really famous Presbyterian, and I'll just say it's Charles Hodge's grandson, and he and Wilson don't get along. They seem to have a different understanding of the relationship between morality, religion, and the military, and so I think that there's something there, and it's. I mean, you can think about being the fundamentalist modernist controversy chronology tacked onto the military.
But what
Um,
was it? What was it with World War One? And
I think it's the loss of the idea of religious institutions. So, for example, if you just have the Bible and God, like that's not going to lead you to have a sort of institutional sense of how things work. In a lot of respects, there's just a real sense of institutions go away. And I think that the nice thing about chaplaincy is chaplaincy provides, and so my book is basically like a paean to chaplains, whether they realize it or not. And so, I mean, chaplains provide this institutional voice. In their person, they are not a church, but they represent a churchly voice. Like you are not just a guy with a Bible who's talking to politicians. You have ordination, right? You're ordained, you are sent. And so I think that the chaplaincy is a place where church and state can interact in a rightly ordered way. And I think that that's what was valuable in the early republic, because the chaplains are a specific type of churchly voice that's morally and even religiously catechizing military men in such a ways the American regime wants that to happen. It's like we want those guys to be saying those things to these guys because it's good for our men to be catechized by these religious figures in a certain way. So is that the government summoning the church to, so quote unquote, to support the regime? Sure. Is that inconsistent with Protestant history? No, I don't think so.
and given, I mean, there has been a move in the last year to more and more chaplains in the government
Right.
with Pete Hegseth and others. You know, and even I think the CIA now has chaplains. So again, you're kind of like you're right on the money with the timing of what's going on. I want to read this quote from in the intro, Hugh Smith Carpenter, the pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn, New York, where my family immigrated to. So I got a lot of Brooklyn people. You say, war, Carpenter believed, nonetheless, had a place in the divine economy of the Christian life. War was certainly an evil, but it was a necessary evil. It was to be understood, quote, as an agent for the control of other evils, as a remedial measure. This is what I like, and it's in quotes. So I guess Carpenter said this. What poison is when employed as a medication in the human frame, what explosion is when it destroys a building in order to arrest a conflagration, what temptation is when it is suffered to try the human life in order to purify and invigorate the human heart. War was analogous to, quote, what prisons are when they preserve the peace of the city, or what the death penalty is when it secures life to society. And so it's just great rhetoric there,
Yeah, I
honestly.
mean, these guys, he ends up saying war has an office. So if you want to carry that out, he basically says war is one of God's officers. Um, and so
Wow.
I think that's something that again these are just concepts that are kind of, I think that in the aftermath of the fundamentalist modernist controversy, there's a real sense just to prescribe Protestant thought to sort of merely soteriology. Um, and actually, in the 19th century and in the 20th century too, guys are saying actually there's more to understand here. I mean, you counsel people in a state government, a big state. Um, I mean, Florida's what, 25 million people,
Yeah.
and so it's the size of a European country. Um, and so if you're called to minister and called to give counsel, like divine counsel, um, to pick a state, um, you're probably called to do more than just tell people about soteriology. That's part of what you do. And so I think there's just more going on here, and what that more is, lots to talk about. But yeah, I think my hope is that people will think a little bit more broadly about not war and religion. I think that's a well-worn topic. But Protestants will think, well, what did our people say?
Yeah.
Instead of
Yeah.
just having to go back to Thomas Aquinas or something like that. So
Well, let me I know we got to wrap up. I'll just give an anecdote that happened to me a week ago just to kind of put feet to this in a different context. But I was meeting with a secretary of one of the agencies here in Florida. And, Florida, Ron DeSantis has been the governor, and this is his last year. And so the whole administration, it's essentially their last year. And this individual was meeting with me and knows I'm a pastor connected to churches and talking about how churches can partner with government to meet certain social needs and such. And we're talking more and more. And I just, so on the one hand, I'm there functionally to help kind of make this connection. And I've done that. I've gotten pastors connected with the governor's office and such. But on the other hand, I'm a pastor, so I'm listening,
Mm-hmm.
And it's occurring to me that they could, like this administration could just phone it in. They got 8 months left. But everybody I'm dealing with in this governor's administration is like at a sprint to the finish. And so, I just kind of affirm that in this individual. I go, I appreciate that it would be really easy for you to just go through the motions the next 8 months because you probably don't have a job after, here, and you'd be working on, what's next for you. But like you are so passionate about making sure these programs are working well. What's your motivation for that? Like I'm like,
Yeah.
So I'm starting to like the human can opener kind of thing. And then I ask, how do you feel about that your time here is going to be over? Because this person already told me it will be. Like, that's just what happens. All, the next governor is going to put all their new, and the person starts like kind of was taken back and starts breaking down. And I said, I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that. She goes, no, you're my pastor right now. Now I'm not your pastor, but,
Right.
but like, that's her way of verbalizing, recognizing here I am from the church, caring for her heart cares and concerns. And then I could point her to, where her real identity is. And it was just a sweet moment. But my point is like, these are the things, like it's so mechanical otherwise. And yet our service matters, and servicemen and women in the military, what they're doing matters, but these are not robots. They're not automatons. Yeah. They have desires and ambitions and fears and concerns. And to put people in the positions to be able to minister to their hearts and souls who are intuitive and in tune and trained on how to do that, one, just pragmatically makes them more effective, but two, is you're caring for the human being,
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate, it's so cool too. Like this idea of war and like, the heart of the warrior that you're tapping into here and how it relates to history. I think you're operating in a very unique space at a critical time when people are actually thinking about these things. And so I thank you for that, Miles.
Well, no, you're very welcome, George. And so anyway, yeah, thanks to all the listeners, and hopefully it'll be an interesting book. And so yeah, it should be out. They'll do paperback and hardback. So the cover looks very nice. Evan's done a good job with it, and so hopefully you and I can talk again. Hopefully before the summertime too. So
yeah, hey, will it be audible? Will it be?
I think so. Yep.
Why don't you read it? I like to listen when the author is reading.
Yeah, I'm afraid my accent will slip out again if that happens. So anyway, yeah, we'll let the professionals read it. So
yeah. Well, last question: have you read Dr. Hart's new book, and has he read yours?
I haven't read his. I know I've seen the cover. It looks fantastic, and I'm going to give him a copy of mine, as I do with all of mine, and he will get a huge acknowledgement because he's a dear friend and one of the best men I know. So I always thank him in everything because I owe quite a bit of my career arc to him, and he's been a helpful guide on so much. And so I'm looking forward to his new book.
Miles, thanks again.
Thanks, George.
The training of the next generation of pastoral leaders is of vital importance. The problem is that seminary is oftentimes incredibly expensive. You have to uproot your family. You have to go to another place where you're not plugged into a local church. What BTS does is it provides a way for people to continue in their hometown, continue in their present ministry, gain the tools that they need for pastoral leadership, be equipped for the work of the ministry for the long haul, and do it inexpensively but substantively. I love that about Birmingham Theological Seminary.